Oh, it's preparing. And the little bar is going slow. Do, 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 do.
Not yet.
There you go. I see us. Do you see us, Vance?
Not yet.
I see us on YouTube.
I see it.
Yeah.
Says
My
live.
phone has gotten a notification. We are live on YouTube.
Yeah, I guess you can just click on it and then that'll take you to the live.
Well, anyway, welcome everyone to Heretics Anonymous. So glad you're here. I already forgot what episode this is because with the computer going down, the flu, the winter, I'm sort of lost track of Saturn and myself often, but the show must go on and we are here. Very excited you're here. Please, if you have questions in the chat, take care of those. Vance will do his usual Sophianic job of getting questions out to the audience. And again, for everyone, this is live on YouTube. It should be on YouTube as soon as we're done with this live show. Not sure if you notice it's a little bit different. We have switched from Google Hangouts to Zoom to make it a better experience for you. But if it should be recording, but regardless, I am recording here on Zoom and I will upload it one way or another. And of course, the audio version will be out next week on iTunes and all the other podcatchers. Oh, and I forgot. Hi, my name is Miguel and I am a heretic, and I have been a recovering heretic for hundreds of thousands of years, it seems, many incarnations. But anyway, enough about me, enough of my drivel, as I like to say. The theme tonight is Gnosticism in Modern Times, a case we've been making on AM by Gnostic Radio and here at Heretics Anonymous. And this panel, very excited about because everybody here is a connoisseur of Gnosis in many ways. People who have enjoyed their ideas and everything else for years. So first of all, Lainie, thanks for being here. It's really an honor to have a conversation with you here.
It is awesome to see you again, Miguel. It's been a while since we've had a chance to chat.
Yes, indeed. Life sometimes takes us to some strange places. But,
even though we live in the same town. So, I mean.
Yeah, big town, a very big town.
Big town, yes.
Very cold and big town. And I have moved. I am no longer in the city. I am in the Illinois countryside. So,
oh, dear.
Yes, I am in southern McHenry County. Last night, we could hear the howling of coyotes and we could see deer running by. So it's a different sort of wilderness other than Chicago. But
well, certainly from where you were living before, too. So,
yeah.
Well.
it's crazy. Yes, it's just a different.
But there's more room for your family.
There you go. That's why we moved. The kids and the dogs and the cats are very, very happy. So
and fewer murders.
Yeah, different types of murders. Yeah, seeing coyotes tear up.
You don't
rabbits.
have to dodge bullets. You're just dodging the coyote.
Yeah, yes, and you're right. I mean, in Chicago, I almost forgot what it feels to listen to gunshots every night, or day.
Yeah.
So it's crazy, but here we are. And of course, joining us too is Scott Smith, author of God Reconsidered and another Gnostikoi. How are you, dude? How are you, Scott?
Ready to rock and roll in a cosmic way here.
Good to hear. Good to hear. And also a pleasure. We've got Christian Smith. How are things going, Christian? Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me. Hello, all my heretic friends. I'm glad to be here.
Yes, all your fans are here, and who knows what spies too. And Vance, how are you doing?
Oh, I'm not doing too bad. I'm sitting here twiddling the controls, looking at things. I have a big zoom on my video, I noticed, so on YouTube. So I guess Zoom has picked me as the Gnostic of the Year.
There you go. You've been awarded. Well, awesome. Awesome. I don't think I have anything else to say. Yes, I actually see the chat, people filling in. Again, give us your questions. I don't know if I have this thing called Super Chat. I think I have it, but where people can pay and they get to answer, they get put at the top of the line. The problem is I have no idea how to cash out this Super Chat thing. So whatever money is just sitting there. So don't worry about that. Just ask your questions. Vance always does a great job of pruning the relevant questions. So again, Gnosticism in modern times. So why don't we go with you, Lainie, since this is your first time, hopefully not your last. Tell us how you became interested in Gnosticism and how Gnosticism has helped your worldview or how to navigate this crazy world.
What a long, strange trip it's been. Funny thing is, I remember when I was a kid, I had a real interest in alternative religion. And I was reading books about the occult and witchcraft and ESP, even when I was, 8, 9 years old. And then got a little older, I ran into Elaine Pagels, who was, still very new at that time. But the thing about just trying to understand what she was talking about was very different at that time. And then, of course, when I was a teenager, I became a teenage fundamentalist. Some kids rebel by becoming goths. I became a fundamentalist and kind of ran that course. Went to college, grew up a little bit, and ended up going to seminary. Entered seminary as an American Baptist, which is a mainline Protestant denomination, but got back involved with the occult and esotericism while I was in seminary. And United Methodist Seminary of all things, but found the independent sacramental movement, found that there were Gnostic groups and that sort of thing, and got involved that way, and was, after I graduated, was ordained as a priest in an independent sacramental group. And then over a very long period of time, was involved with various esoteric churches, was eventually made a bishop in 2009. And I've been involved with the neo-Gnostic community for a long time in various forms, although mostly within the Western esoteric tradition. Worked as a co-host, as you know, on Talk Gnosis. Colleagues over there for a while, did a radio show on the occult here in Chicago. I do have a small church that meets in my home, as well as a pretty significant candle ministry for people who need prayer. So it's been very long, windy road for me, but it's been something else.
Awesome. And I guess the question is, what do you find fulfilling about Gnosticism? For example, I can say the Gnostic ethos helps me understand the idea of suffering, theodicy, dealing with reality, even finding peace. Even Gnostic philosophy helps me explain the world, and many reasons I've given. What is it for you?
It's changed over the years. I mean, and sometimes I will also admit it's been a form of spiritual bypassing. There's always I'm blaming the Archons, or, things aren't going well because the other people around me are not Gnostic, and you can justify it. So there's that really evil aspect to it that it's come up for me at various times. But it's also, as you point out, it's helped me to understand suffering a lot more. And it seems to me that oftentimes when people are looking for reasons for their suffering, they either have fingers pointing at them. Well, what choices did you make that brought you to this? Or they have people who are trying to remove all responsibility. And I think that Gnosticism can offer a different understanding of suffering, why you're suffering, why you are burdened, and that how do we understand ourselves in a system that we can't really escape from, but that we can know about, and that can give us a clue as to how to align ourselves with it. So that's been really important. And for the past couple of years, I've had a candle ministry where I light candles for people who are in need of support. And so I hear from a lot of people about their own burdens and struggles, and this has been really useful for me in being able to offer that support, but to also to be able to minister in a way that's not unhealthy for me. So it's meant a lot to me over the years, but it's also often shifted depending on my life circumstances.
Mm-hmm. And how would you say it shifted? You're talking about your views of what the Gnostics are, or how they relate to you? I mean,
well, it's more to do also with my own consciousness. I mean, where am I at a certain time? And there have been times when I, shall we say, been healthier than others. So that's shifted, but also my understanding of Gnosticism. One thing is, kind of in the circles that I've run in, it's very connected with certain forms of esoteric practice. And when I started my church a few years back, I decided that I wanted to not have any association with certain fraternal orders, and that sort of thing, esoteric orders, but to instead be a little bit more open in that approach, because one question I think that we all consider is, we have a bunch of different early movements in the early history of Christianity that were kind of thrown under this big tent of Gnosticism. Well, there's some question about that. And also the fact that people who are calling themselves Gnostics today, they may be inspired by those movements and those writings, but they're trying to reconstruct something that was kind of left dormant for a long time. Why do we feel a need to reconstruct something? Why do we feel a need to ally ourselves with another spiritual tradition such as Western esotericism? They kind of latched on to the Gnostic mythos. Why do we feel that we need to do that? Why can't we work on our own ideas about what it means to be a Gnostic today? And so I think that that's something that I'm constantly struggling with and working on.
Oh, I'm sure that's obviously what the Gnostics struggled with 2,000 years ago. Again, this sort of fluid, anarchist, individualistic, explorative. I mean, you had all these lodges, and they were struggling, and often they were slamming each other as they were slamming the church and the Roman Empire and all that. So it's a good vibe. And so why don't we go with Christian? What exactly attracted you to Gnostic religion and perhaps the Gnostic church?
Well, like Lainie, it's been a very long, almost a lifelong process that started when I was about 15. I've had a number of mystical experiences that could rightly be understood as Gnostic. But as far as my recent involvement with the church, and it's only been very recent, that started in kind of an ironic way, because it was through the Army, which is not exactly a spiritual organization. And, you know, I joined the Army with a great deal of ambivalence and a lot of questioning about the moral rightness of doing so. And when I first joined, I thought, well, maybe I could serve as a chaplain in the Army, and that would alleviate some of my concerns about the Army as an institution. I decided, however, that I wasn't religious enough to serve as a chaplain, but this was before I knew about Gnosticism. So about a year ago, my wife asked me to reconsider whether or not I wanted to be a chaplain. And a light switched on for me, because I realized that in the Army, people really aren't looking for chaplains that are super religious. That's very much an interfaith culture. And there are lots of agnostics, lots of people who describe themselves as spiritual, but don't identify with anything. Atheists are aplenty, and they need somebody who they could just relate to. And so I started considering, okay, well, if I'm going to become a chaplain, what kind of chaplain am I going to be? Because I have to choose a religion, I have to choose a church. And it seems to me that in order to be in integrity with myself, I don't have a lot of choices, really. Because, as you know, through many conversations with Scott, I am extremely aware of the amount of suffering in the world and the inadequacy of the religious options for explaining or addressing or really taking seriously the problem of evil and suffering. And it seems to me that there's really only two options for adequately addressing that problem. One is atheism. Well, that's not really an option. The other is Gnosticism. So it's pretty obvious which choice I had to make. So I had a lot of practical considerations in choosing this path, but I'm very early on in the path, and so this is really an exploratory time for me. And I've only recently moved to California for this purpose, and started attending the Ecclesia Gnostica here, but I'm still a newcomer to it all, and it's all very fresh and new and strange and marvelous. And I'm very much enjoying the journey.
Awesome. Glad to hear. And glad you're at least finding your path and finding your truth. Or as I say, keep running with those searching for the truth and avoid those who have found it. And it looks like you're on your way. So let's go to Scott. What is your CIA handler telling you about how you joined the church, Scott?
Well, I probably do have one, as I've discussed before. When I was a journalist covering the war in Northern Ireland, I managed to find out eventually that I have a 300-page FBI file, half blacked out. And so I'm sure they're still monitoring me, or maybe it's the aliens or something like that. And hopefully I'm going to take a little less time than I normally do talking about my history. A lot of Aeon Byte shows, particularly the ones around Halloween, we've talked about my background, but to kind of give the headlines, I grew up Mormon, and as some of your listeners will know, Mormonism is a cousin to Gnosticism in another number of ways. It believes that human beings can achieve literal godhood, and Harold Bloom has several books out, The American Religion and others, where he talks about the Mormon teaching of everyone can have a direct connection to God. It doesn't have a professional clergy, so that does decentralize the notion of connection with God. And we're all supposed to have personal revelation on the truth of the Mormon path and so forth. And my turning point really started at 17, and I became aware of animal suffering through a brochure somebody sent me in the mail. And this was the time when vegetarianism and animal rights were really coming to the fore in the late 60s. And that set me off on a path where I ended up writing my first book called Animals in the Gospel, about Mormonism and animal suffering, because Mormonism has a very advanced notion about animal rights and animal souls and so forth. And out of that came, I helped found kind of the forerunner of Vegetarian Times, and eventually I sold my national newspaper to them. And at the same time, I started in the natural food industry and have been in and out of alternative medicine and stuff. And I should add, one of many points in which Chris kind of has intersected with my spiritual life, literally on the day I started in the natural food industry, Chris was born. That was one of a number of intense things that happened that day, because I had never run a retail store or worked in a retail store before. So this was kind of the beginning of the adventure with Chris, you might say. And moving ahead a number of decades, he and his mother and I parted ways after a couple of years. And we didn't have much contact, but he came to visit in 1990. And it just happened to be Father's Day, and I was going to interview Scott Rogo, the famous parapsychologist. And so Chris and his mom joined me. And Rogo had never really done a lengthy interview about his 30 books. He was a really pioneering thinker. And at the end of the interview, I asked him two questions. One was, what do you think about the idea of animal souls? I mean, we don't get any reports on them from near-death experiences. And then he turned me on to one that he knew about, and that became another one of my books called The Soul of Your Pet. And it's had a long afterlife on Amazon, although it's no longer in print. And then I asked him, after all the research you've done on the paranormal, what's your philosophy? What's the overarching explanation of why we're here on Earth and God's relation to us and the meaning of suffering? And he said, after 30 books, I'm more confused than ever. So it was still the beginning of kind of my, what became my search for a philosophy that would match what I had discovered about suffering and evil in the world. And as I was typing up the interview a few weeks later, I found out he was murdered. So his landmark interview became my entree to Fate magazine. And Sandra, who's now my wife, and I kind of embarked on this whole career of interviewing famous psychics and testing them out, James Van Praagh and Uri Geller, and did a lot of other adventurous stories. I went to Ireland to interview people who had supposedly seen fairies, did a talk show there, all kinds of fascinating, wild stuff. And this was before my legitimate career in the 2000s as a business journalist. And as I really tried to find the truth, I traveled the world. Sandra and I went everywhere from Saudi Arabia to India, and I became close to the Hare Krishnas, looked into Jainism, but I couldn't find anything that really explained evil in the world and the purpose of life and so forth. So I became very disenchanted with Buddhism, which has been very fashionable among agnostics and those who want a religion without a God, essentially. And I looked at it really carefully, decided that didn't have the answers. And I had a mystical experience that made me realize that I had not found the right philosophy. And so finally, in 2005, the LA Weekly in Los Angeles published a story about Stefan Heller, the bishop of Ecclesia Gnostica. And as soon as I read it, I knew that what I had been shown in my mystical experiences was answered by this philosophy of Gnosticism. And it turned out Sandra had actually been to Heller's many, many lectures, and I had basically never heard about this stuff. So that really was the start in 2005 of my interest, and that eventually led to kind of boiling down everything I had learned about world religions and the big issues. I've had a kind of an unusual career where I've written a lot about history, and I was very aware of prehistory and how no conventional religious tradition can explain why God would put us here. And certainly not the Judeo-Christian tradition that I grew up in, that basically said God is benevolent, all-powerful, and all-knowing, and he created our genetics and put us into this environment that shapes our personalities, but somehow he's waved this magic wand of free will, and we're responsible for our sins, on top of, Eve giving Adam the apple and all that stuff. And so we're kind of on our own, and he gave us free will, and anything we do is going to be on our heads, and we're going to go to heaven or hell accordingly. So Gnosticism gave me a different way to think about all these things, and I found it was extremely powerful, not in having all the answers, but if you go through a checklist of kind of what you can conclude about the world and the nature of the hereafter and stuff, it's really the only philosophy that comes close. And that led to my writing the book about my search and my conclusions, God Reconsidered, and I've got a website devoted to it, godreconsidered.com.
Yes. Sorry, I was actually looking for a copy of your book. I was going to throw it over. Maybe Vance can get a backdrop of God Reconsidered for a promo or not. But, well, we got Ganesha, so that's good. So awesome. I wanted to ask you something, Vance, but first I want to get back to Lainie. What do you think about what Scott said, or the Gnostic idea of theodicy of evil? Do you think that there is ontological evil, or how do you see the structure of the universe? And I'm sure it's evolving like all of us.
Yeah, it's absolutely evolving. I was very interested in what he had to say about Mormonism. I've become more aware of esoteric Mormonism in recent years, and the way that it is structured. And it's actually, I think, a very interesting religion. As for structure of evil, it's, I'm working with it, which I have to. I think we all have to do that. And yeah, it has always been very distressing to me that the conventional Christian approach to this is so inadequate. The Calvinists, of course, I think the Calvinists kind of have it down. Well, yeah, God's a sadist, and he likes some people, he doesn't like others, and he demonstrates his sovereignty by torturing some people and being nice to others. And you have to admit, they got it right down there, but that didn't suit me. That didn't suit me one bit.
You have no free will either.
Yeah, and you have no free will, and sucks to be you, or it's great to be you, and it's okay. I guess you go there. But no, I think what he points out is very important. I think that's always been a real stickler for me. And I will say, as somebody who went to theological seminary, one that was in the main line, one where we were trained in pastoral care and counseling by instructors who not only had theological degrees, but also were licensed mental health practitioners with, degrees in psychology and whatnot. The real inadequacy of much of what we were taught to provide. We were taught to provide presence, and I think that that's important. It's always important, the presence. But in terms of offering answers, people face unconscionable. The evil that people have to deal with in their lives is just immense, and the inability to give anything that was even reasonably coherent as an explanation always really bothered me. And so, looking at, and reading Philip K. Dick and the Valis trilogy, the idea of this alien God and our inability to, the way our own consciousness has been affected by this evil has been incredibly helpful. Of course, trying to explain that to somebody when they're not speaking your language can also be difficult, but there's also ways of putting this to people. And I think that there are some scholars who have done a really good job of attempting to explain what the early Gnostics were probably looking at. And I think the other thing to keep in mind is that they were all living under empire. And I think that can't be ignored. And one of the things that we see in Valis is the empire never ended. And I think that's incredibly important when we're understanding evil, is that when you have an empire, you have this, you have an emperor who has decided to expand his or her territory, does not know these people, does not know their language, doesn't know their customs, has this whole hierarchy of governors who's trying to rule everything. And everybody is supposed to be allied with this emperor who nobody knows, and he doesn't know them. And I think if you can, that I think people can understand. And I think anybody who took history can understand that. And I think if you can start to bring that to people and say, well, this is what you're laboring under. Why do you think that this, happened in the context, when something happens to you that's bad, or when you're experiencing something that's evil and there's no way out? The description of empire, I think, can be incredibly important, or even just bureaucracy. We know that living in Chicago, but these can be very helpful tools to bring to people today. And the Gnostics, of course, would have known that because of their own situation and place in history.
Yeah, well said. As above, so below.
Exactly.
If us humans, and of course the ancients believe in correspondence, if we're a mess, then we're a reflection of the heavens, that maybe the heavens are mismanaged. I think that's what the Gnostics saw. So did Paul, so did many others, right?
And so did Gurdjieff. I mean, Gurdjieff is another example. I mean, that he's been my primary spiritual inspiration over the past several years, and he saw this. I mean, he basically saw that things were so messed up that most people were living under what he called a law of accident. Now, he wasn't what we would call necessarily an orthodox Gnostic, and of course he was existing, although I believe he was aware of the Gnostic teachings that people were aware of back then. But for him, the average human is living under a law of accidents. We're so below even the planets that the planets or astrology doesn't even affect us. And I thought that was just kind of interesting, that things were so disordered that even the things that the Gnostics might give some credit to having an effect on us, in his cosmology, that's not even affecting us yet. So I think there are different ways of approaching it. Gurdjieff made a lot of sense to me, but I think also if you look at government, hierarchy, bureaucracy, that can be really useful.
Right, and Gurdjieff saw us humans as basically robots asleep. Most people were, but like the Gnostics did, we're just sort of
going through the motions.
Yeah, wallowing in ignorance. So,
and also, I think I was talking with a therapist friend about it, and he said, one of the more difficult things for a lot of Gurdjieffians, and I expect Gnostics, is the realization that your parents may have fucked you up, like the poem says, but your parents themselves, you were being raised by robots, and you're a robot being raised by other robots, and that's a very painful and traumatic thing for many of us. But it also can be, in my opinion, a step to liberation once you realize that.
Yeah, well said. I think I wanted to share with the group and the audience. Last night I was at a Alcoholics Anonymous meeting at a Lutheran church, and one of the person who heads the meetings is the actual pastor. They're the head pastor. He's a recovering alcoholic, and we were talking about again the presence of God and why things happen. I don't know how it just got that way, and one of the members there who was in our group, she killed herself last week. She decided she was suffering from depression, and she just went one day and she just hung herself. And so there was this struggle with the group, and the pastor kept saying, well, it's God's will and this and that. And the others in the group were buying into that. And I was sitting there like biting my tongue because all I wanted to do was stand up and scream. I said, don't you see, this is evil. This is bad. What about what's hidden in plain sight? What Paul talks about, what the Gospel of John talks about, that the Gospel of Mark and Satan ruling. This is bad. This is a bad world where a human being has to end that way, that she worked so hard for her sobriety. And at the end, her inner demons just destroyed her and the whole group. I didn't know her that well because I've only been here, 7 months, but everybody in the group and the community is crushed because it's a small town. So, but I wanted to scream at them. And I know the pastor and we've got into debates about Augustine and others, but I've never actually brought up the Gnostic thing. I'm still secretly a member of this church or going to these meetings, but, and it probably wouldn't have worked, although some of them you could tell they're struggling with this idea of there's a plan and the grace of God and everything works for a reason. I know they're struggling, but it's not for me to say that in that context.
Yeah.
I think that as bad as fundamentalism is, any kind of religious fundamentalism does give you the comfort of, having that cliche, it's all in the plan and everything like that. And it just as in, it's kind of insidious when you get to the other end of the spectrum, the Course in Miracles and all the New Age stuff, the Eastern philosophy, it's your karma, you deserved it, or it's all part of the plan, it's all good, all this kind of stuff. Yes, the Holocaust, it's all good. Hitler the second, he was just cleaning up
the war in Yemen. That's a beautiful thing, yes.
Yeah, and like the tsunami, as Stephen Heller wrote, the tsunami just happened to kill those 250,000 people. They all had it coming at that time, and it's part of the plan. Yes, and all the earthquakes, how about smallpox and bubonic plague? Part of God's plan, it's comforting, and yeah, you don't want to burst bubbles, but this was one of the things that had perplexed me much of my life before I discovered Gnosticism, was the fact that this is a world of accident, as Lainie said and Gurdjieff said. This is an area where when you throw into the mix genetics and early family influence on your subconscious, which affects your relationships later that you're not even aware of, all the neat little plans about whether it's east or west, about how, you know, you're following your destiny and all, even the concept of predestination. I mean, yes, either everything is perfectly set up like a vast robot universe and it's just playing out automatically, and God switched this on and he's watching this movie that he already has seen, and he's bored. He's not even a sadist, you know. The first time around, I guess, or when he first saw everything happen, maybe he was a sadist then, but now it's to the point of boredom. It's all playing out, and he can predict every single thing. Everything is predestined. Every atom, the way it moves, the quantum level, the planetary, universal level, every bullet, every germ. It is, of course, absurd. So what I think an honest evaluation is that there can't be any grand plan, somebody in control of all this stuff. So if people accept the notion that is more shamanistic, that God is not all powerful in this material dimension, that there are contending, if you will, shamanic powers, which is kind of a dualistic insight of not only Manichaeism, but it does kind of get reflected to varying degrees in other forms of Gnosticism, that if you can simply accept the fact that the bad guys do have power in this world, and the transcendent God doesn't necessarily have the ability to intervene in our daily lives. And once you get that, then you can realize, you know something, let's not get too hung up on trying to live this Judeo-Christian or Buddhist or Hindu life according to a long list of commandments, because we recognize we should be good people while we're here, but nobody can even figure out the truth. You know, if God, quote unquote, wanted us to follow a certain path, that could have been made clear. And if people did have free will, then they could make some choices. But it's almost impossible for people to even find out what the truth might be. And Gnosticism offers an opportunity to accept the chaos and accept the fact that God is not all powerful in this world, and be at peace with it, knowing that we have part of the divine in us. It's a great faith for people who are willing to confront evil completely, look at the entire scope of history and evolution and the suffering, and just say, you know something, all of this does exist and it's not an illusion, but I can accept that there is a transcendent world, and I will live a good life and try to do things according to my conscience, but I'm not going to get caught up in all these dogmas of human beings, East and West. And Gnosticism gives you that ability to have that kind of mystical connection with God, to find, let's say, your aeons or the spirits who can guide you, and to use prayer and meditation, all these things, and have a life of purpose and beauty without all the baggage that comes from traditional religion.
Preach it, brother. Preach it. And yeah, I want to ask, amen. Can I get an amen? I want to get the moondog in here. What do you think, Vance? What spoke to you about Gnosticism, and what do you think of evil?
Well, the Bible itself taught me about Gnosticism before I ever heard any of you guys or the Nag Hammadi library or anything. I decided to sit down and read the Bible one day. I said, wait a minute, what the heck is this thing? Killing everybody, doing all this bad stuff. And so, you know, I said, wait a minute. And I read Genesis very carefully. And one thing I noticed, everybody look at the Bibles, chapter 1 and chapter 2, somebody's fudged where chapter 1 ends and chapter 2 begins?
Uh-huh.
To make it look like one story, but it's two stories. And, the Jesuits will tell you that. I got this dictionary of the Bible from them, which tells you they're pretty honest about certain things, about the Yahwist, the Elohist, but that's another story. So, but I was a mystic before I was a Gnostic. And I was a Catholic before I was a mystic. So I was a good Catholic. I did everything they told me, but I was kind of in my own little world. And somehow the idea of an entity, of loving entity like Jesus, meant something to me, right? And it really did. I took it to heart. And that was carried forward later, although now, whether Jesus really lived as a man with a beard or the Bee Gees looking guy or whatever is irrelevant. But the mystic thing was basically, in a nutshell, for this tonight's video, an experience, something communicated to me and showed me, not just told me, showed me that all beings were united at some level, not in the ordinary level, but at some level. And what spurred that on was a phone conversation with a blind girl. I was phone hacking when I was in college, and there are these things called loop rounds. You dial up this number, instead of ringing, it goes dead, and anybody who dials in there can talk to you from all around the country. Now, in the 70s, this is a big thing, right? Because we didn't have cell phones, the internet, or anything. The ARPANET was around, but couldn't have access to that easily. So anyway, I had this experience with a blind girl in Oklahoma where I could hear her thoughts and she could hear my thoughts. And about a week or two later, this experience happened to me, and it was kind of resolution. Well, how could this be possible for two minds to kind of merge partially together? And that's when the whole thing came to me, and the answers to that and so forth. And that was the mystical experience. Years later, 10 or 15, I don't remember exactly how many, I started studying the Bible, and that's when I realized I was a Gnostic, and I'd heard a little bit about them, but I've learned a lot more since, I've been hanging out on Eon Byte. So what it means to me is that it gives you a framework for actually looking at the reality of our plight in this world. There's a lot of beauty, but there's a lot of ugliness. And I figured out something that maybe people find out to be useful, which is all evil winds up to be traps. And we're trapped down here. And if suffering, it wouldn't be suffering if you could just get out of it, right? If you escape. Suffering is something's got you pinned down and is causing you pain that wants you to go, but you can't go because you're pinned down. That's the essence. Well, alcoholism, drug addiction, something's got you pinned down. You're a slave to something, but you can't break out of it because you are trapped. So Gnosticism kind of explains the basis for that. The why isn't God, why isn't God good, or this or that, and the whole idea of anthropomorphic gods, the way the Orthodox religions teach, big man in the sky with the white hair. No serious theologian believes that, right? If you really talk to somebody who's really studying religion, they'll tell you, well, the deeper you get, the more, conceptual, and God is spread out, or he's like a network, or this or that. It's not a big old man in the sky, and I have something, where is he? It's not this. So, and Matt went into long, we are all almost like network nodes in God in some sense. And then there's higher levels. Reality is layered, So people in the chat room were talking about duality. Well, Gnosticism is a dual thing, right? And it shows you, the good and the evil, the aeons, which emanated from the Ein Sof, or the one, the Abraxas, the God above God, the unknowable, and so forth. And really, all religions tell you that God is really unknowable in the end, right? What religion really seriously tells you, except in Sunday school, which is what most people stay with. That's a layer of reality. Sunday school, like your parents give you when you're being brought up, right? They hide the ugliness of the world from you so that you don't grow up too broken. So that's what churches do too. So that's what Gnosticism means to me. And I found it a source of inspiration, because the people that are Gnostics are thinking, they're awake to some degree or another, and they're thinking about the origin of the universe, the nature of being, all these things in a serious way with their eyes open, rather than telling a fairy story and covering it over. We're brave, we try to be the Gnostic warriors that go on and, face reality no matter how ugly it is, or no matter how beautiful it is. And beauty can be a trap too, right? As I could tell you some stories about that from my past, but that's what Gnosticism means to me, and it's relevant, and it makes us look at the world in different ways rather than being programmed. It's an independent, having our own thoughts, taking responsibility for our spiritual beliefs and values and so forth. And I've always found it to be very relevant to today, even though I'm interested in all the Christian history stuff too. I really like that for some reason. But aside from that, even if I wasn't, it's a way of life. It's a path where you've got your eyes open. So that's my 2 cents.
Well said, amigo. Well said. And Christian, do you have anything to say to this, or do you have a question? Again, we can go round table. I shouldn't be the only one asking questions. I know I can see Scott's head moving about the whole evil thing and so forth that Vance is saying. And he's probably thinking about Kamala Harris against Trump in a few years and all that good stuff. But what do you have to say, Christian?
Well, we've talked a little bit about the importance of, not being appropriate in sensitive situations, and not bursting people's bubbles, and not, the situation that you described. And, it's a very sensitive situation. You can't just challenge people's basic theology in the middle of a crisis like that. And yet people need to be woken up. And I wonder, how do you wake people up without popping the bubble? Has anybody had success at just deflating the bubble? And I'll tell you a little bit about my experience. I've been in conversation with a friend who went to, who was in my philosophy program as an undergrad. And I've been talking to him for about 10 years about basic theological issues. And he's been trying to persuade me into his somewhat Calvinistic worldview. And we've been talking about the problem of evil from the very beginning. And it wasn't until finally very recently that I just laid it all out for him and just, said in very frank terms, just how evil things are, and how could you possibly believe in a God that created all of this and controls all of this, and for his own glorification. And it woke him up. We haven't finished this process yet, but all of a sudden he saw things from my perspective. So all of the intellectualizing and the arguments and stuff, it didn't get anywhere. But when I kind of punched him in the face with an emotionally powerful message, it woke him up. And I don't know how he's dealing with it at this point. He said he was going to get back to me. He's a very thoughtful person. And, he's praying about it and thinking about it. But I haven't heard back from him yet. So it's a process. Hopefully he's hanging in there and not in crisis. But has anybody had success at just deflating the bubble?
Last night I wanted to stand up and say, do you realize this universe is ruled by a demon? And I realized that would have gone like a lead balloon. The head pastor, he's 75. He plays his violin. Really nice guy. I love him to death. But it was no point. I didn't even want to go there. So,
well, as a former Mormon missionary, I do have some insight in how to use the Trojan horse to wake people up. The Mormon missionaries talk about the Bible. They don't get to the Book of Mormon until a long time later. And in the current Reader's Digest version of Mormonism, they don't bring up any of the magical stuff and the temple ceremonies and, you can become a god and all that kind of stuff. So, basically they're depicted as Baptists who just don't drink coffee, basically. So what I found is helpful is, first of all, you have to, this is like AA, this is a program of attraction. And so Jesus said, let those who have ears hear. So what you do is every so often, whether it's on Facebook or in your AA group or whatever it is, sharing, or business lunches and networking with people and stuff like that. You can put things out there, and I post every day a very strange mixture of kind of hardcore business articles I've written, CEO interviews, things like that. But I also throw in my God Reconsidered stuff, and people do respond. So you put it out there and see who is receptive. Now, for the Christians who are somewhat disillusioned, but they don't really know much about the real story of the Bible, I think that real searchers are big readers. So I like to start with Bart Ehrman's Jesus Interrupted, which was really the introduction to me on the fact that, you know, the four Gospels are not harmonious at all on anything, whether it's who Jesus was, what the plan of salvation is. You quickly find out from reading Ehrman that Christianity, as we know it, is not very Christian. It's certainly not based on the New Testament. The Trinity, the plan of salvation and atonement, all these things that are central to modern Christianity really are not found in the New Testament. These are all later inventions. And so I try to get people who are interested to read that. Another thing that helps, I think most of us have probably read Jared Diamond's Germs, Guns, and Steel. The average American barely knows American history, let alone the history of the world. Now, what Diamond does is simply show how insane that the near history of the world going back a few centuries was in terms of how it was impacted by germs, for example. Your average American living in the 21st century really has no clue when it comes to evil in the world broadly defined as, for example, epidemics. This is, I think, part of the problem with Mormonism's optimism about this world is that it's a very worldly religion in a way, which is why Mormons are so successful in business. But this kind of early 19th century positive notion about, you know, everything that you do in this world counts and will be taken into the next world, that, you know, it really matters if you get a higher education. This is kind of looked on literally as part of your eternal progression, because Mormons don't believe that you simply, you know, die and you're assigned a place on the other side. Mormons don't believe in a hell, but you're assigned one of the different kingdoms of heaven. No, they think that there is eternal progression, potentially up to godhood. And all this kind of excess optimism comes out of, I think, the fact that in the 19th, 20th, 21st centuries, Americans really don't have a notion of what the world has been through in the last 200,000 years since human beings evolved into what we would call the modern human. And I think that lack of knowledge of the disaster of history and just how bad it has been limits American understanding of why conventional religions really don't have a good explanation for all this. And so getting people to read a book like Jared Diamond's or Bart Ehrman's is a good way for people to get started. And then if they want to get serious about kind of taking the next step, Richard Smoley's book, How God Became God, is a great introduction to how Jehovah started out as a tribal deity. And he also goes into all the problems in the New Testament. I really think anybody who reads one of these books will realize that they are now awake. They can't see the world in the same place, the same way that they did before they were exposed to this. So that's been kind of my approach.
I'd like to, if you don't mind, jump in here because we're getting some great stuff here. First of all, Scott's been talking about, he used the word disaster, and he was talking about epidemics and pandemics. Recently, I became involved with the Community Emergency Response Team here in Chicago, and we are a team of trained civilians that support first responders in case of a disaster. And one of the interesting things is that the definition of a disaster in part is that it strains the current hierarchy of support services. And we have this community, we think that we are so safe living in modern America. The fact is, one thing goes pear-shaped and we are all in deep doo-doo, and quite literally when the sewage system goes down. And I've been taking certifications and responding to nuclear disasters, which is still and remains a real concern. And so learning about what it means to work within a disaster situation, if that doesn't wake a person up to evil, and the fact that we are not all that secure, and that we are still incredibly vulnerable, and then there's what's keeping us around is certainly this web and this link, these threads, as there was actually a movie about nuclear disaster called Threads, made in the UK, but together. But once those things break, all hell can and will break loose on multiple levels, not just human interaction, but chemical interactions, biological interactions, climate interactions, and getting the education that I've gotten has really just opened my eyes. So I thank you for what you said there. Also, Christian was talking about the importance of waking people up. My day job is as a writer, and I recently did an article on people who are victims of workplace mobbing or gang bullying. And one of the interesting things about many targets of gang bullying is that they are good people. They are nice people. They are conscientious people. And one of the difficulties is that they cannot see that they are the target of evil bullying because they think that they're a nice person, they're doing their job, and they can't understand what is going on, and because of that, time slips away that would give them the ability to respond or even stop or slow down the bullying, until finally they're so mired into it that they've actually, their performance has dropped at work, and they're in a problem. They're in a really problematic situation. So I think the idea of being able to recognize evil when it happens, see evil when it happens, rather than just pushing it off or ignoring it or assume that one doesn't deserve this, I think that's a crucial survival skill, perhaps, that Gnostics or anybody who seeks to be spiritually aware has to develop.
That is really well said. But and let me ask you, Lainie, when people come to you for guidance, or they want to be part of your church as a bishop and all that, and what is you might say, your duty as a Gnostic bishop? I mean, obviously, you're not there to save their souls in the traditional sense, are you?
I couldn't even fathom how I would go about that.
Yes.
I think in many cases, what I would say is that you have to use some discernment, and that's going to be, certainly if a person needs presence, they've, their grandmother has just died or something like that. Yeah, I'm not going to start pointing fingers at that point, but I think that there is a sense of discernment. You have to develop discernment, and I would say that is a spiritual skill, to understand when you have to wake a person up, when a person is telling a story. A lot of people will tell these stories that are based on their own traumas or their own understandings, and if you can tell them the story back, if you can say, well, you've given me these facts and you've come up with a story, I'm going to take these facts as you presented, and I'm going to tell you a different story. And that can sometimes reframe the situation to the point where they can see things that they need to see. And I have found that to be useful.
And my mute button wasn't working. Yeah, great words indeed. And well, you hear that, Christian, and your job eventually, this is stuff you're going to have to do. It's going to be some hard things. I mean, people are going to come to you in pain, and you can't pull out the world is ruled by a demon. There'll be a lot more nuance than that, right?
Yeah. I've made a mental note to remember that technique. That sounds very effective. So I will be practicing that.
And
feel free to get in touch too. So.
Okay, thank you, Lainie.
And it should be noted, isn't the difference, Lainie, in Gnostic priesthood, when I used to go to the church at Villa Park, and obviously with, keeping in touch with Stephen Heller and you and the AJC, it's not, as I say, guiding people's souls, but ultimately it's initiation, right? Isn't that what Gnostic priests do? They initiate you into the mysteries of life.
I think it depends on the Gnostic priest. I mean, I know some that take that approach. I know others that they're far more, shall we say, Catholic or, you know, Orthodox in their structure at least. And so they would not necessarily use those terms. I think a lot of people are comfortable with the sacraments as the traditional sacraments and that language. And I think that that's fine. It's something that I tend to use, although having been raised Protestant, I'm not as specific about it. But I do think a lot of what we do, I think we all struggle to not give pat answers, but it's easy to get lazy as well. So as I said, this is one of these things that it's an ongoing struggle. It's, when we all have our own path and we all have our own way of operating as Gnostics. Some of us have put our shingle out and said that we're clergy. Others are teachers or writers or contemplatives or whatnot. And I've put out the clergy signal, the clergy sign. And so I struggle with it. It's something that I genuinely struggle with. And what I have found is talking to other people can be very, very helpful. That doing this right now, I've already gotten some great ideas this evening, so I'm grateful for that.
Good deal.
Do you serve do you have the ritual of the Eucharist in your church?
Yes.
Uh-huh.
Yes, we do. And we do experiment with different liturgies. There have been several Gnostic churches, many Gnostic churches have worked on developed their own. I'm not always crazy about what I've found, so I continue to experiment or work with it. But the central mystery there, this is my body, this is my blood, has always been extremely meaningful to me. And so that is part of what we do when we meet. So, and also I would point out about a lot of Gnostic services is we don't have music. I don't know of any I don't know of personally of Gnostic churches that have music. So the worship does tend to focus on sacrament liturgy, sacrament prayer, and perhaps some preaching or a teaching of some sort.
Yeah,
Is there a reason?
I was going to say the Ecclesia Gnostica does use music, but for people who are interested among your listeners in understanding kind of a Gnostic interpretation of the Eucharist, since not many of us believe in the literal importance of the resurrection of the body of Jesus, there are some incredible lectures by Stephan Heller at gnosis.org. And if you click on there, there's a category, Gnosis, Gnostics, and Gnosticism, which has a lecture by him called Jung, Gnosis, and the Sacraments. And Heller has given quite a bit of attention to this as the sacred mystery drama. And Jung, despite his background coming from a very, very strong Protestant family with a variety of ministers and so forth, he really put an amazing amount of emphasis on this as kind of essentially like a mystery religion. And the other thing that is interesting about this is that when you become baptized in Ecclesia Gnostica, Heller has you read the account of Charles Ledbetter about seeing a spiritual energy rising as the Mass is done. So apparently people who are psychically sensitive can feel that while the Mass is going on. But I do think kind of an intellectual understanding of the notions of metamorphosis and our godhood and identification with the God in us and all these other symbols really helps appreciate the importance of the Eucharist, because although it's part of Mormon tradition, it's done in a pretty stripped down way. There's no big long prayer and so forth. It's more contemplation and just passing out the water. They don't use wine and bread. But I found that the emphasis in modern Gnosticism on the Eucharist to be kind of surprising and exciting and interesting. And it takes this movement beyond the usual kind of New Age wishful thinking and visualization, things like that. And I think it does represent a genuine connection to the original Christian tradition.
I have something to say about this as a recovering Catholic. Even when I was 9 years old, I got something I don't think they taught us outright, which was the body of Christ. Well, you were eating the wafer, right? And the wafer is supposed to be Jesus's body, right? Well, I knew it was bread, but the way I took it, even as I was 9 years old, is that, well, I was taking part of Jesus in me, and therefore my body would digest it, and Jesus would become part of me, and I would become part of Jesus, and everybody else that was eating the bread would also. And so it was a mystical thing. It was a unity of, even though it was put in terms of body, in the flesh type of thing, it was a unity of spirit. And that's how I always have thought of the Eucharist. And it was a uniting with, of our divine spark with, the entirety, or more like a Gnostic, the realization that all the divine sparks really aren't separate, except they appear to be. And so I don't know if that has any relevance, but, it does to me as far as the Eucharist goes. Also, somebody in the chat room asked me to share. I don't know if we have enough time. There was part of my part of my mystical experience that I call the cosmic loneliness, and it bears directly on the Gnostic cosmogony. Anybody want to hear that? You guys?
Absolutely.
Let's hear it.
Sure.
Well, whatever this thing was that was communicating to me showed me how our universe started. And it was like a huge, first there was like a void. It was nothing. And there was like a deep, deep loneliness, because it was like I was this thing, and it was like there was nothing else. There was nothing to do. There's nobody to be with. There was nothing going on. Nothing moved. It was an experience of this void. And then a giant something built up in the void. I don't know how. And it just exploded out into eventually what became our universe, just like spewed, kind of like the Big Bang. And but the loneliness that was profound, and it was almost like something to cry about. And then at some level, this thing always is like that, but projects itself out into each one of us. And it wants the joy of reunion. Every time someone realizes or reconnects with it, it's happy or happier. And that's what it was looking for. That's what the whole thing was for, to experience itself somehow and all these things. But I think what happened was, and I don't understand this entirely, though, we talk about the fall of Gnosticism. I think some of these things just got too far away and they forgot. And that was basically was blind, I think, asked it in the chat room. That's the essence of what the cosmic loneliness experience was. It wasn't just a thought. I felt this. It was, I went through this. It was very interesting.
Very cool.
Yeah, and that correlates, right, with the stories, the Gnostic stories of how the universe began. Pretty much the same thing. So I guess I was a Gnostic back then.
Which came first, the Abraxas or the egg, Vance?
I don't think we've heard Miguel's confession.
Oh,
What? Are we confessing here? I didn't see.
How we got into this heresy.
Oh my God, I don't know. I was just in a podcast the other day, and I guess it was always being a sense of not belonging, a feeling that this wasn't the right world, not understanding why they were suffering. I mean, I could go on how these things kept reinforcing it, but I didn't have a worldview to attach it to. It was, Catholicism, Buddhism, even the Greek myths that I loved as a kid. I was like, you're not explaining a lot of things, and I'm not explaining this ecstatic joy that you really, when you start reading the Gnostic Gospels, you see that connection where they're just going so out, like the scholar Eric Davis said, as nobody went as far out into the cosmos as the Gnostics. I mean, they went way out, and all they cared about was, at the core, was liberation. That's really the Gnostic thrust, liberation and integration. And they made no bones about it, as they were unapologetic and criticizing this fake world. So But even before that, again, it was the idea of not understanding the advance, what's wrong with the Old Testament, and why the Old Testament God is probably more prevalent than just in the stories of the Old Testament. I mean, I remember as a kid, I'm 4 years old, and there's a bird on the sidewalk. And I'm like, oh my God, mommy. And I give this bird, and there's my mom, who was my God, right? And my mom says, well, let me see what I can do. And I said, my God's going to heal this bird. I'm 4 years old. And then, the next day I'm like, this bird's dead. And I'm looking at my mom. It's like, God, my God has already failed me. And this sort of things that goes on, the suffering of animals, the suffering of children, and so forth. And again, this very Neo from the Matrix idea that I felt lost in this world. I didn't belong. I used to think, well, if I'd been born in the 60s, I'd be happier. If I'd been born at the end of the 19th century or in the medieval times fighting knights, there was always some world. And I thought, well, maybe if I was in the plot of this author of this movie or in another dimension, things would get better. And as you get, I guess, more gnosis and things hit you over the face and you gain more knowledge, you say, no, I think the way out is way out. And once I started understanding about the Gnostics, everything got put into place. And like Lainie was saying, it's still a process because it's a lot to swallow. And my ego is always telling me, the whisper, what the Muslims call Satan, is telling me, oh, don't worry, there's a plan. Just settle down in your material world. You've got an iPhone over here. You've got a car on the driveway. Everything's going to fine. Go with the flow and just be satisfied. And I can't do that because, again, I think I took the red pill as much as some days I do want to just forget myself in this world and sell out. So that's a short version, you might say. There was never no falling off the horse like St. Paul. It was a slow burn into this fiery realization.
So how did you decide to start this podcast? That's a big quantum leap.
No, not really. I think it was my curiosity. I'll be honest. I had been to a Gnostic church, and it wasn't really satisfying me, or there were some issues. Again, I was starting to realize that there was politics and the usual stuff. And I knew I didn't belong in that church. So, and I still wanted to learn about Gnosticism. So I said, well, what's the best way to learn about Gnosticism is talk to people who are experts or who know it. What's the best way where I can commit people instead of having to call them up, buy them lunch, or harass them on the phone? I said, if I start a podcast, I can do these interviews. Not only will I learn, but I can actually share with the others, because after all, as I like to say, it ain't Gnosis unless you share it with the world. That's part of it. You've got to scream it. You got to give it away so you can gain even more out of the world. So one thing led to another, and I was like, wow, I just call Bart Ehrman and he'll be on the show. Oh my God, I call Stephen Heller. He'll be on, Tim Freak back then, remember in the 2006, his books, him and Peter Gandhi's were selling like hotcakes. They were huge back then. And it was very fortunate. And I just thought this was sort of you might say a grace. This is the path I should take. And here I am years later, just a popularizer of, what does Stephen Heller call himself? I can't even pronounce it.
Popularizer? I can't pronounce it either. Never mind. Forget it.
Popularizer.
Popularizer. Thank you.
She popularized me with science. Oh no, it's another word. So she blinded me with science. So that's basically been my journey, and I feel it's a great journey. It's a very challenging journey.
I'd like to put in a plug for both of your books, Voices of Gnosticism and Other Voices, because they are phenomenal resources when you can see it in print.
What an accident. I just happen to have a copy here.
Oh.
Complete accident.
Yeah, it's one thing to listen to the interviews, but a lot of it goes in one ear and out the other. And when you see it in writing and you can underline it and flag certain passages, I'm going through about the third time now on both your books and getting a lot out the third time. It's almost like reading the Bible. The fourth time you read the Bible, oh, I didn't notice that scripture before. So now I'm going the third time through both books and refreshing my memory on some of the things that people have talked about. It's really I'd strongly recommend it to everybody if you really want to take a deep dive on all this stuff.
Oh, well, thank you. Thank you. Well, good deal. Any other questions from the audience there, Vance?
I don't see any tonight. People aren't asking questions as much as they have been in the past shows. So
I've got a question for Lainie.
Yes, sir.
Okay, so, I'm interested in, as a chaplain, being able to conduct contemplative practices of various sorts. And I wonder, in your church, other than the Eucharist, are there other practices that are emphasized and that you teach?
I have found, yes, in the sense, my church is very, very tiny. I should point this out. But prayer is very important. Prayer is very important. And as I said, I have a candle ministry. I have set, over the past couple of years, several thousand candles for people over time. And we also have a viewing on Facebook. People can actually watch it live. And it's quite wonderful. I get a lot of support from the community for it. But there's a very strong prayer ministry. I myself like the use of prayer beads. I don't necessarily do the rosary myself, but prayer beads I've found to be very useful in disciplining mind and body and getting them to work together. And I am going to put out a plug here. One of my minor order clergy is a wonderful woodworker, and he has actually created a rosary board for people who have hand and wrist issues. So he has actually burned into wood a life-size rosary, so people can actually trace the beads with a fingertip rather than sliding them if they have any kind of repetitive stress injury that would make that difficult for them. So we are a prayer bead liking people. We found that to be very useful because I am, partly it's my Gurdjieffian influence. There's a strong mind-body connection there. Mr. Gurdjieff was very big on developing various aspects of a person. So that's also been incredibly important for me. And also in terms of contemplative practice, meditation, also reading scripture, both the canonical Bible as well as the various Gnostic scriptures. I'm a big believer in reading out loud.
Mm-hmm.
I think that it's too easy to get into your own head when you're reading silently. And I would also say reading with intention, feet on the floor, spine straight, and reading the scriptures out loud. I have found that to be an enormously helpful practice.
Out loud in community or just individually?
Both work, I think, very well. Mr. Gurdjieff, he wrote his book Beelzebub's Tales to his grandson, and he urges people to read it 3 times. And the second time, you are to read it out. You're to read it as if you're reading to another person. Most people have taken that you should be reading it out loud. He doesn't actually say out loud, but as to another person. And I have found that to be a very useful practice with reading any sort of scripture. Oh, and reading the print version, not an electronic version. And I'm not saying if you can't get, it's more convenient to have the electronic version, go ahead. But I have found that a print version is a lot better for that kind of sacred reading. That's my opinion.
Mm-hmm.
Try it out, see what you think.
Well,
Right.
for those who haven't heard the news, they did some experiments with Kindle, and it doesn't stick in the brain like a real book.
Really?
No, I'm not surprised.
Not surprised.
With regard to the study, for those who are interested in having the experience of Gnosis, I think that since we don't really know a whole lot about the ancient Gnostics and what they went through in terms of coming to this path, and I am one of those who believes that there is some shared aspects in the various Gnostic groups. But I think the most important thing is the insight that we are both connected to God and that this is not our world. And whether it's Marcion or Mani or the Cathars or any others, they didn't necessarily have to have a dramatic mystical experience like some of us have had, but they did have to come to that insight that the conventional teachings of Christianity really weren't accurate. And, you know, when you read things like Richard Smoley's book, and for that matter, Bart Ehrman, you can't come away with the same naive view of the Bible that you had before. And one of your guests, who's is featured in your book, Miguel, David Brackey, said that one of the reasons he really thought that they had some kind of profound experience in this regard was, he said, you know, it's inconceivable that Jews could have come to the conclusion that Jehovah was evil. You know, there's a certain cultural box, and they somehow burst out of it, and the seed spread. And you know, if you look at through Jung's visions, where the figure of Philemon comes to him and then later reveals he was Simon Magus in his mortal life. And of course, Simon Magus was a Samaritan, and it would seem like some of the Gnostic seeds were planted, if you will, in the Samaritan heresy. And of course, Judaism has its own kind of underground tradition, and it only fossilized, the overground religion fossilized, you know, as they started writing down their scriptures and stuff. But it seems to me that that insight that the Creator God is, or at least as presented in the Old Testament, is not who he pretends to be, and all that kind of derives from that, including a powerful force of evil that doesn't seem to fit into the traditional Christian notion of, you know, God is all powerful and Satan, he's just letting him play around and tease us and dragging us down to hell for the fun of it and all that sort of thing. That insight that we can transcend this world, and we don't have to go through, you know, the 144 different commandments in the Old Testament and live up to them to avoid going to hell. That central insight that can come from reading great books like another one of your guests, Miguel, was Gary Lackman, and his Jung the Mystic helped me understand the psychology as it relates to the Gnostic mystical path, and also April DeConnick's the Gnostic New Age and things like that. I really think listening to all your podcasts, reading these books, you really get a sense that you become awakened, that everybody else is so blind to the human condition that, you know, they've been planted into this world without any clue as to the bigger picture of reality. And I think for those who are looking to come to that insight, it may not come dramatically, but through reading, prayer, meditation, listening, all these things move you forward in that direction. And you may not even realize when you cross that line, and suddenly, you know, your eyes are open. And I think that for those listeners who are kind of not quite there yet, you know, just keep doing these things. You will get to that point where you feel awakened.
But Scott, why not just kill yourself if this is a horrible world? Have you had that one thrown at you?
What I've pointed out is that if you go back and you look at the Gnostic mass movements, and the most obvious would be the first one would be the Marcionite Church, which spread very, very widely. Most people don't realize that. Now, they had one kind of flaw in their business model, which was they didn't believe in marriage. And so it was kind of tough to keep the congregation going. But it did spread very widely. And of course, Manichaeism was the first like world religion, and spread into China and into Southern Europe. And the Cathars, who dominated, or at least their culture dominated southern France and so forth. And how were these people perceived? Well, the Manichaeans and the Cathars in particular were perceived as people who were practical. They were craftsmen, a little bit like the Jains in India, and they're not, allowed to herd animals and stuff. So they become craftsmen, and they are in businesses that don't involve killing animals directly. And so it's a curious kind of side effect of when you're awakened, you realize that, you may not be following the 144 commandments, but we are in this world and we want to make the best of it. And once we realize that, we shouldn't hate those who don't follow our path, like so many other religionists do or teach, then we can open ourselves up to the notion that we're in an imperfect world. People have an imperfect grasp of what they should do. And our job is to kind of shift that balance. And the Gnostic seers kind of conveyed the notion that the universe changes a little bit when you spread enlightenment and do good things. And so the Gnostics in this world were really remarkably good and practical. I mean, the Gnostic perfects were called the good men and the good women, and they were even admired by their Catholic enemies. And I got the same sense from reading about the Manichaeans. So I think that the answer is that when you're awakened, you realize that killing yourself has a lot of other implications to those around you, those you affect, your family. It's one thing, if you're suffering from cancer and you believe that you're justified in leaving this world. But if things are reasonably good for you, you count your blessings and you see what you can do to help other people. And I think that kind of goes with enlightenment. And by and large, the Gnostics I've known have not been depressed and haven't felt like that the solution is, hey, we shouldn't have been here to begin with, so we're going to kill ourselves and, speed up the process.
We'll show that demiurge by killing.
There we are. We're going to keep the demiurge, So, at least that's my impression.
I think Buddhism actually does have some wisdom in this arena, and Moondog touched on this earlier, that when you are awakened, the nature of suffering changes for you, but it doesn't change for those around you. But once you have overcome, I don't want to say overcome your suffering, but once the quality of suffering has been altered, you're not moved to try to get out of the world. You're moved to try to help those around you. So here, the Buddhist vow of the Bodhisattva seems to be appropriate for the awakened Gnostic.
Good point.
Mm-hmm. I would say it's a good point. And you were talking about scripture, Lainie. What are some of your favorite Gnostic gospels or even Orthodox gospels that you like to read out loud or read to other people?
Well, I will say a few things. I really like the Gospel of Mark. I don't know why. I think it's the simplicity that appeals to me. I like that very much. I also periodically, and this is going to sound bizarre, but I sometimes like reading the more bizarre books of the Bible, like Ezekiel. If you try, well, yeah, Ezekiel would be one example, just because it's so bizarre. And there's also been some shifts in Bible scholarship in which some scholars are beginning to look at some of the books of the Bible through a lens of trauma. These folks have experienced collective trauma, and this is how they're processing it, which I think is kind of interesting. Also, reading some of the very oldest books of the Bible, when you get into these really old stories, there's a real sense of amorality to them. And when you read about Jacob and Esau, for example, I mean, it's a completely amoral story. And in Sunday school, they try to dress it up, but when you actually read it out loud, you realize that it's very amoral, and it gives to my way of thinking, a very different understanding of the God that's being described in these texts. The other thing, of course, Thunder Perfect Mind. I think a lot of women find it very compelling. I think a lot of men find it compelling as well, particularly when you look at the interesting correspondence between that and the Daughter of Fortitude prophecy that was given to Dr. John Dee through Sir Edmund Kelly. And the similarities between these two pieces of information from a female deity or spirit of some sort that are very similar in many ways, even though there's no evidence that there was that Thunder Perfect Mind was buried for a long time. So those are some of my favorites. I think one thing that I've struggled with some of the Gnostic scriptures is they don't necessarily preach all that well. I went to seminary. I do like to preach, and sometimes those pieces can be more difficult to come up with a traditional homily based on them. So that's something that I've struggled with. But I think the more I tried and more that I'm willing to work with those scriptures, and again, reading them out loud from a paper book, I've come to a greater and greater appreciation, but it does require time and effort.
Yes, indeed. I mean, a lot of the Nag Hammadi texts are definitely, they are rituals, they're initiation processes, they are, again, it wasn't the traditional, you might say, priest talking to his congregation. These people were into very much, when you look at the results and the rituals, it's very much like a mystery religion process that they were going through, the incubation, the going down to hell, the flights of the soul, and the ideas that came out to it. So maybe that's why, again, they read a little bit different. But yeah, Thunder the Perfect Mind is truly amazing. I really need to read that out loud again. So anybody else have a question or a comment? The floor is open.
We had one from the group on circumcision. Someone was wondering, did circumcision enter into the Gnostics a long time ago? And someone wanted to know if Charya S, what she thought of it. I don't know, Miguel, you were good friends with her, so I don't know if you know or ever heard her talk about it, but that did come up.
We'll talk about what?
Circumcision.
Oh, okay. Not the Gnostic, circumcision.
Well, and I'm kind of broadening the question a bit by implication. What did the Gnostics practice circumcision, and what did it mean to them? And this one gentleman wanted to know if Acharya S had ever spoken of circumcision.
She was definitely against it. I mean, it's male mutilation, so she was not into those Abrahamic rituals. And yes, if the Gnostics were obviously riffing off of Paul, and Paul was saying that circumcision was a spiritual thing and so forth, then pretty much no. Although you did have the Ebionite Gnostics, who were very much, you might say, Jewish Christian. They hated Paul. They were again, they were less, they were more towards the Jewish Christian part. They might have practiced circumcision, although we don't really have any record of that. So
circumcision might have convinced the Gnostics that Jehovah was definitely evil.
I would think so. I would think so.
Yeah, I forgot who was in the Old Testament, one of the characters, to impress the girl, he had to kill all these Philistines and bring their foreskins up to this girl or something like that. I mean, it was just it's pretty odd.
Yeah, very peculiar.
And well, Yaldabaoth he was into meat. Did you ever notice that? That's another thing. Meat, barbecued meat, circumcision meat, the heave offerings, the wave offering. It's all about meat with this guy,
or at least the smell of it.
Yeah, the smell
turns
of it.
him on.
Yeah, it pleased him, that meat, that smell of that meat.
So that means he has a nose, right? Interesting.
The nose knows.
Yes. Yeah, that was a fake nose tick, right?
Circumcision.
Oh, that hit me bad.
Yeah, see what I did there?
Yeah, I did. I wish I hadn't.
Sorry. I was talking about being trapped before.
Well, at least he didn't put a picture of a circumcision behind you, Vince. So spared us
Don't
all.
give him ideas.
Oh no.
That's pretty close there.
Oh.
You wanted to say something, Christian?
Oh well, just circumcision was the physical covenant with the God of the Old Testament. I couldn't think of a more appropriately disgusting physical covenant for what the Gnostics regarded as the demiurge. So
yeah. And here's speaking of body mutilation. I obviously have tattoos, but I was reading there's a sect of the Gnostic called the Pitatrics or Pitratics. And they were pretty, again, one of those crazy Gnostic sects. They actually went, and I'm going to write some more about it in a blog post, but they actually went and said, not only is Jehovah evil, but so is Osiris, Persephone. Every pagan god is evil. And they put the big bad guy, of course, was Saturn and Kronos. And all these gods had rebelled against the good God. So the world was even worse because you can't even go to the pagan gods for some help. But of course, being Gnostics and deciding that they wanted to, part of being freed of the world and part of to stick it to the gods, because they were mixing Christian and Jewish myths. And in fact, they said Jesus came to fight all these pagan gods. So you got all this really cool fan fiction. This is in the 2nd century.
Oh wow!
But
Sounds
Harry has
wow.
Yeah,
sounds
they
like the
used
makings
to,
of a great comic book series.
It is 2nd century. They would tattoo, I think, on the back of their necks, they would tattoo a serpent, and they said it was the mark of Cain. And because they had a mark of Cain, they were invulnerable to any of the forces of this earth. So pretty
Oh, wow.
cool. So yeah, the Gnostics certainly like tattoos, some of these sects.
Too bad. I interviewed Stan Lee a couple of times, and I guess we just missed our opportunity to pitch him a great new movie idea.
Yes.
I've got a question for the Mr. Moondog. But I'm going to preface it with an experience that I had about 18 years ago. So I, at that time, was a very avid seeker of and practitioner of esoteric arts. One of the things that I was into at that time was Reiki. It was sort of an up and coming thing. It wasn't super popular and well known like it is now. And I was doing all kinds of Reiki and having, all kinds of quasi-miraculous experiences. And for me, it wasn't just about Reiki, but all of the things that I was studying, I considered all of my studies to be a way of accelerating my path to enlightenment. That was my goal. I wanted to become enlightened, and I guess I was a little naive about some things. One of my ideas was that I had taken a liking to the notion that we're actually already enlightened, but we don't really know it, that there's a paradox there, and that we just have to wake up from our own self-imposed delusion, and then boom, we're enlightened. And so to get this point across to my teacher, we were going around a labyrinth, and he was talking about the importance of slowly meandering your way around this labyrinth, and I said, I don't want to take the slow path that's gonna take probably lifetimes to get through before I become enlightened. I want it now. So I'm like, I'm just gonna go right to the center of the labyrinth. I'm gonna walk right over all of these little paths and break the rules and go right to the center, because that's my right. And so that just kind of demonstrates my mindset at the time. And I was I had this urgency about it. And all of my experiences culminated one day with the master Reiki attunement. My teacher gave me the attunement, and I was surprised because I didn't experience anything. It was absolutely nothing. It's like, okay. She was like, oh, really? Wow, there's all kinds of, there's like a fire on your head. And I was like, okay, well, that's interesting. Well, it was a delayed effect, actually. I didn't realize that I was experiencing a lot because I was experiencing so much that I couldn't process it. So pretty soon, she's talking to me and giving me all her symbols and all this stuff. And I start to just become hyper focused on her lips and on her face, and just how extraordinarily beautiful that she was, that I didn't notice before. And suddenly she stops and she notices that I'm weirding out, and she's like, okay, there's something wrong here. You okay? And I tell her to keep going, but my breathing increases. I'm starting to see. I'm starting to see the sense of beauty like radiate out from her to everything around me and into the air. And pretty soon I start to have this experience of seeing a light emanating from everything around me, from the very molecules of the air. And it wasn't that I could see a light, because it was just sort of a sensation of like as if there were light. So it was sort of like seeing an invisible light is what I call it. And
Like
I'm sorry?
like auras, perhaps? Something like that?
No, it wasn't even, there was nothing there visually. There's nothing that I could see. It was just a sensation as if I were seeing it. So I don't know how to describe it exactly. So it's just like seeing an invisible light, and it was this, and then before long, I had this sense that the world was like it was as if it were stained glass, and it was starting to crack, and the light was like coming through the cracks. And at this point, I had laid down and was breathing very hard, and she was at my feet. Like she said, like I needed to come back. She was like, you're, wherever you are, come back. Like she was trying to ground me or something. And at this point, I felt as if the world was about to just like shatter, and that I was going to see this, whatever it was that was behind everything. Like, and I had this sensation of a voice. And it wasn't, again, actually a voice. It was something between a voice and a thought and a feeling. I'm not sure how to describe it, but it said, so to speak, or rather, it gave me a choice. It was a red pill, blue pill choice. Of course, it wasn't in those terms because Matrix wasn't out yet, or I hadn't seen it anyway. And all of a sudden I had this terror come over me, because I had this sensation of, if I make the choice to shatter the world and see what's behind it, I'm going to die. And not just like physically die, but I'm going to cease to exist. Whatever it is that is behind it all is just going to absorb me, and I'm going to be gone. And I had this terror that there wasn't even a light behind there. It was just a nothingness, and that I would just be absorbed into the nothingness. So I had this moment of terror, and then it laughed, and it said, "This is what you asked for. This is what you asked for." And I thought to myself, well, should I make the choice? Should I dive through that stained glass? But already the opportunity was gone. And so I took the blue pill. And ever since, I've been trying to get back to an opportunity to take the red pill. But I guess I'm going to have to take that long walk around the labyrinth, and maybe at the end of my life, I'll get back to the red pill moment. But my question for you, Vance, is, what the heck was my question for you? Okay, so in your vision, you talked about everybody becoming one. Can you relate it all to this fear of everybody becoming one? Because, you know, there's this that was this fear that I had, was, you know, that I'm going to lose myself, that as an individual I'm going to cease to exist. And to me, that was just as bad as if there were nothing that existed at all, that there was no God, that it was just a nothingness behind it all. And so I wonder, you know, can you speak to that at all? Have you ever had any kind of fear like that? And does your experience, do you think that your experience implies that we are at some point absorbed into the one, or something like that? I'll let you take the floor.
Sure. Well, that thanks for that. You know, sharing of all that is very interesting. Yes, I can relate to it, but not from my original experience, which was more of the reverse. You know, it's more coming from that cosmic loneliness where there was nothing to lose, to all of this. And even in the imaginings of everything coming back and uniting, that I wasn't concerned, you know, or that didn't bother me then. But more recently, as I've been getting older and, you know, health problems crop up and the idea that I might not be around forever, you know, comes to me. My original experience left me with a very deep realization of this connection, but I ponder and I think about all the things that I am, that I've done, all the skills that I've had, even the fact that I've been blessed with all these experiences. And then, well, is that all just gone? You know? And that leads me to think about, well, what do we take with us? What is left behind? I know a lot of things are left behind, like all these little incidentals, like where I worked and what I was doing. All these things that come and go don't mean anything. But how about my loved ones? How about my wife that I love very much? How about my son? Will I ever see them again, or are we just absorbed into it? I had another experience one time during a past life regression or whatever, and between lives, I went to this place where it was all white, and we were all one again. And this is a different feeling than the original mystical experience. And it's kind of like we were all there together, and the thoughts were all mixed up. But eventually, I got restless, you know, in my memory of this, and just kind of went back and became, you know, incarnated being again, I guess you could say. So yeah, and it's terrifying because you know what it is? It's the loss of all the things that you've worked for, all the accomplishments that you've made, all these things, just to lose that, you know, and to go back. But the other thought is, that's a little bit on the other side, is comforting, is that number one, all the things that I really am will be. Oh yeah, no, there's also the fear of coming back as a little starving black kid in Africa. So no, I gotta spend my whole life starving and suffering, and that's the nature of the earth, right? That's it. That's real, you know. I mean, if we're this is reincarnation, obviously,
Absolutely.
but I believe in this is just the belief that we can navigate to what we want to do next, and all the important things like the realization of oneness and so forth will come with us and will surface again, you know, like the tip of the iceberg. Because why did I have these experiences this time? I didn't work for them, really. It's not like I studied or went up in the mountain or read books when I was a kid. These are just things that I must have come here with, along with a lot of other things. So I don't know if that's a good answer, but that's my some thoughts on what you were saying and my experience.
Fantastic. Thank you for sharing that.
Anybody else have anything to say to this before we wrap this up? This Heretics Anonymous?
This was
here
good.
now. Yeah, this was a lot of fun. Well, I think then, yeah, why don't we come to the end of it? Thank you very much for those of you in the chat room. Great conversation, some good questions. Glad to keep us heretics company, even though you are heretics too. But we are the ones who made the choice away from the normal, and here we are with the God in the gutter of Philip K. Dick in the dark edges of town. But that's where the Gnostics are, and that's where the seekers are. So first of all, Lainie, it's really awesome to have you on, and we should definitely do it again.
I loved it. Anytime, just let me know. I'd be happy and honored to join you.
Awesome. Good to hear. And
It's great.
Christian, thanks for joining us.
Absolutely. As always, it's an honor and a pleasure. Thanks, Miguel.
Pleasure and honor is all ours. And Scott, thanks for joining us. And of course, don't forget, audience, GodReconsider.com.
Thank you, Miguel. It's always fun, despite my reservations.
Yeah, you do have some Sophia with you. And Vance, thanks for being here and taking care of business.
He's the man.
As usual,
Dog's the man.
Yes, he's the man.
the hidden power behind all the screw ups, you know.
Is that the prophets behind you, spelled in different ways, or is that the FBI's all-seeing eye, or?
That's my all-seeing eye. See, it's while looking at you.
Awesome. Yeah, this was a great conversation. And for those of you, this video will be on YouTube, and I will have an audio version out next week in all our channels. And of course, for patrons and members of the Archive of Past Shows, I will have the full enchilada and so forth. So, but anyway, thanks for being here, and really thanks for being yourself, and thanks for everything that you have done. And like I always say, write your own gospel and live your own myth.
Thanks, Miguel.